For the past 11 years, I have been jamming control decks in basically every format. Modern, Pauper, and of course, Standard. Oh, also, I play a lot of control decks in Commander. So here's a video about that. All of my knowledge on how to make a control deck in EDH. I'll go over how to identify a control deck, build a control deck, and win with one. Also, I'll touch on why you might want control at your table, and why I think control decks are the best option for budget players. I understand that some players have this notion that a control deck ruins an EDH pod, like how a landmine ruins the feng shui of your living room. This is something I acknowledge and will address later. Additionally, I'm sure many of you have already watched the professor's video on the same topic. I wanted to address that this one will be a little bit more in-depth, and I do disagree with him on a few key points, but this is by no means a call out or anything. I have nothing but respect for him. I even met him IRL once at the first Command Fest, and he was really nice in person. I just happen to disagree with him on a few things about control in EDH. But first, if you want to build a control deck, check out Cool Stuff Inc. and use code TTM at checkout for a discount. You can get a great deal on some Magic product, and it supports the channel. Thanks to Cool Stuff Inc. for sponsoring the video. So how do we actually classify a control deck? Putting a deck into one category is always a bit tricky, especially because decks can have elements of aggro, combo, or control without fully falling into any one of those categories. Also, just as a note, I'm going to be ignoring stacks for this video. There are some individual stacks cards you might want to play in a control deck, but this video is more focused on traditional control, not stacks, which is control via mana denial. I have other videos about stacks, check them out, here's a card. I would argue that instead of a deck fitting neatly into aggro, combo, or control, it's more like a stat spread, where your list can have elements of different things and lean one way or another. Like how one random combo in your deck does not make your list a combo deck. But if your whole game plan is built around finding one combo and using that, then you would be a dedicated combo deck. And of course, there is gray area in between a deck that has no combos and a dedicated combo list. So your list might have some control elements, like counter magic or board wipes, but it might not be a dedicated control deck. Very few EDH decks fully lean into one category. I mean, a lot of burn spells can often be turned onto creatures and become removal, so even an aggro list might have the ability to do control-esque things. This is why I ultimately think the vast majority of commander decks are mid-range decks, since they usually have some elements of aggro and control and don't super heavily lean into one or the other. Most players will run some board wipes or removal, even if it's not a control deck. Let's talk about what makes a control deck different from a mid-range pile. This is actually the first place I disagree with the prof. He says that a control deck wins through inevitability rather than attrition like they do in 60-card formats. While somewhat true, I don't think that actually separates a control deck from a mid-range or aggro list. There are a ton of commanders that have inevitability. Many of the most popular commanders create card advantage or continuously buff up your board, sometimes both. Almost any commander that is a mana sink has inevitability. A Sisters of Stone Death Gorgon Typal deck will have inevitability with their commander, even if they don't build around it at all. In fact, almost every commander deck has some form of inevitability and ability to grind out games. It's just the nature of the format. Your opponents will almost always eventually be able to recast their commander, which does commander damage, and that commander damage will eventually take you out of the game. I think a control deck is defined by its ability to outvalue your opponents in the long run through attrition. We are playing for the long game. We want to have resources once your opponents have run out of gas. And this is done by using removal offensively. Most well-tuned commander decks will run some board wipes to catch up if they fall behind, or spot removal to disrupt an opponent's key card. Most commander decks will use cheap and efficient removal defensively. They save removal until their opponent is about to win, like hitting a combo piece or removing a big creature. Maybe using spot removal to get rid of something that's slowing down your game plan. And this is what you should be doing in any mid-range deck, saving your removal for when it's most crucial. But a control deck doesn't use removal for exclusively defensive reasons. The difference is a control deck overloads on the amount of removal they have, such that they can hit their opponent's value pieces and threats. Then by stopping your opponent's value piece and landing your own, you can win over a long game of attrition. You stop their card draw, then you draw more cards and use those extra cards you draw to stop their threats. When they have no threats and no card draw, it's going to be really hard for them to win. A control deck wants to be in a position where the board is clear, they have a full grip of cards, and everyone else has close to 0 cards in hand. This is when a control deck aims to close out the game, and that timing is what makes it a control deck over midrange. But there is an inherent problem with removal. In 1v1 Magic, control decks will usually play efficient 1-for-1 removal, and then they play card advantage to get more removal until the opponent is out of threats or the control player runs out of life. If you 1-for-1 everything they have and play cards that draw more than one card, then in theory you can hit all your opponent's threats before you run out of removal. Then you want to stick a card which can either close out a game fast or gets value turn after turn. Oftentimes a planeswalker fills this role. Those are the key parts: removal, draw, finisher. But in Commander we have a problem. The 1-for-1 removal is inherently not as good. When you use one card to remove a threat, it's good that you no longer need to deal with that scary creature or whatever, but your opponents have gained some sort of benefit as well, since they also now don't have to deal with that threat and didn't need to spend their removal on the card. This makes 1-for-1 removal almost card disadvantage rather than an even trade. This is the fundamental flaw with control in EDH. So to make your control deck function well in Commander, we need to get around this flaw. There are multiple ways to do this. The first way to do that is by drawing a lot of cards. If 1-for-1 removal is card disadvantage, then play lots of card advantage. Card draw is king in Commander. It's almost always the best thing you can do, so overload on it to mitigate the downside of your 1-for-1 removal. Another way to get past this is by having repeatable removal. There are many ways to recur your removal and get more use out of it. Executioner's Capsule is decent on its own, but with a salvaging station, it's suddenly as many Doomblades as you want. Or something like the Seals in a Muldrotha deck, letting you bounce Doomblade and Naturalize every turn. There are dozens of ways to reuse removal spells, and if you can set up some way to do so, then you can use that 1-for-1 removal over and over again without losing any real card advantage, because you're just looping the same removal. Another way to get around removal's card disadvantage is to have static effects that slow down or weaken things. If you have a Pillow Fort effect like No Mercy or Dissipation Field, most people will be less likely to swing into you. Dissipation Field sometimes backfires if they have an ETB creature that they want, so use this with caution. Pillow Fort effects like Maze of Ith can easily count as multiple pieces of removal. Sometimes Pillow Fort effects are even better than removal because those creatures might instead swing into another player. Another option is you can just play a lot of board wipes. You can play your normal game plan, and then when you're behind on board, use something that clears everything. This way it's not a 1-for-1, and you're removing everyone's stuff, so all your opponents lose out, not just one. I do think jamming 10 board wipes is pretty ineffective. Yes, you should run some board wipes in your control decks, but cutting spot removal to just run board wipes is not always the best idea. Part of this is because most board wipes are sorcery speed, and you might want to remove something at instant speed during an opponent's turn. Also, overloading on board wipes can help other control decks, whereas instead, if you just threatened spot removal, maybe you could get a player to swing into the other control deck at the table, and that ends up benefiting you quite a bit more than just board wiping. I also want to specify that you probably don't want to remove everything all the time. I think this is a point of confusion about control decks, that they have to counter everything and remove everything on the board, but this is not true. Until you have your looping value removal engine set up, you don't want to be spending your spot removal on everything you see, because it's card disadvantage and it's going to be really difficult to then keep up with the amount of threats 3 players can play. You have to think about what is most dangerous and what you really do need to counter. If you're playing something like Talrand, most creatures aren't a big deal, since you'll probably have chump blockers to block it. Unless it has trample, of course. Meaning you can let almost any big creature slide and just later on bounce all the creatures with a board wipe when you're ready to set up for your own win. One thing you do want to counter or remove often is early game card advantage for your opponents. This is where I want to address drawing your opponent's cards. Since the control deck is trying to get around this fundamental flaw in multiplayer, giving your opponent's cards is often the worst thing you can do. It's really hard to win the war of attrition if your opponent gets to draw cards and draw cards from you as well. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. If you are playing a wheel deck, a forced draw list, or something that just cares about your opponents having lots of cards in hand, then drawing them cards is fine and can be used in a control deck. There are always exceptions to anything in MTG. This is true for any guide or template you see about EDH. Sometimes you break the conventional system for a specific reason. But in general, if you are playing a control deck, I would not recommend cards that give your opponents more cards. Giving them creatures or life for political deals can be really great, especially because you can control when that value goes away oftentimes. This is why I would not recommend cards like Wheel of Fortune or Windfall in the average control deck. Even if you are refilling to 7 cards, you now have 21 cards to deal with. And again, I want to stress, these are not bad cards, they're just bad in a random control deck that doesn't have a use for them. This is another place where I disagree with the prof. Arcane Denial versus Counterspell. If you've been a fan for a long time, you might know I'm not a huge fan of Arcane Denial. I've made videos about it in the past. I'll make another one in a year or two. That video will be a project. In this video though, I want to take a brief tangent to talk about Arcane Denial in the context of control. I think it kind of misses the point of control. Arcane Denial is best used defensively. When you only run 1 or 2 counterspells in your whole deck, and you use it to protect your combo, or ideally to counter a fog effect when you're swinging in for lethal. In this case, Arcane Denial is great, since you take them out of the game, don't give them any cards, and you get to draw next turn. But remember, for a control deck, we're not just using removal defensively, but instead, it is an offensive tool we use to slow down our opponent's advantage. Here's an example. We're in a good spot as a control deck. The game has gone late, few board wipes have been cast, you have a finisher in play, the game will close out soon. Your opponents are hellbent, things are looking good. But then, an opponent top decks and casts Painful Truths. Well, we need to stop their value. Right now, we're in a situation where each player is only going to draw 1 card per turn, and you can probably deal with that before they're able to mount any defense against your finisher. But with Arcane Denial, it's difficult. Yes, technically, drawing them 2 cards on the next upkeep instead of 3 right now is worse for your opponent, but having your opponent draw 0 cards is instead always better. Look, there are a million different reasons to play any card in Commander, and almost all of them are valid. If you simply like the art, it's the first card you ever owned, that's reason enough to have a card in your deck. EDH is a fun, casual format. The only thing I can actually address is power level and synergy. So just be careful when and where you give your opponents cards in a control deck. That's all I'm saying. Speaking of counterspells, you actually don't need any. Control is often associated with blue, but you can play control without it. Don't get me wrong, blue is the best for control since counters are the best spot removal since it hits every type of card, including instants and sorceries, which most other colors really can't interact with very well. In addition to that, blue can stop enter the battlefield effects or death triggers. So in a non-blue deck, you would need to compensate for the lack of counterspells in some way. And I'll tell you how, right after this video's other sponsor. Hey dude, you got any trades? Yeah, what are you looking for? Oh, a blue Tonkavu. Not sure I got one of those. Do you mean flame Tonkavu? Look, a blue Tonkavu. I'm not sure, I haven't seen this card. I'm flipping through my binder here. I don't see the one you're talking about. It's eating me. Has this ever happened to you? Spending precious minutes flipping through your binder looking for a card that isn't there just to be ravaged by a wild beast? Well, no more with Card Castle. Create a digital catalog of your collection and easily search for what you do and don't have. Scan cards with your phone and browse your collection anywhere. Sign up is free, and if you click the link in the description, you'll get a free month of full access. Back to the video. So for non-blue control decks, how do you beat instants, sorceries, enter the battlefield effects, and death triggers? In black, you have discard effects. Cards like Mind Slash or other repeatable discard effects can take powerful instants and sorceries out of an opponent's hand before they get to cast them. In white, you have Nevermore effects. If a Cyclonic Rift or Farewell will ruin your perfect Pillow Fort prison, then these effects can stop one of those cards. Red and green has less of these effects. Playing protection spells can kind of become counter magic against certain things, and red does have a counter spell. But if you're going mono green or mono red, you may run into some issues with powerful instants and sorceries that you can't interact with very well. You may have to add some colorless options to help. So how powerful is control overall? I think a lot of people assume Oops All Counterspells is really strong and only played by the sweatiest of blue mages. But this isn't true. Well, there are plenty of sweaty blue mages, but Oops All Counters is actually not very good. Overloading on spot removal will cause you to fall behind on card advantage and not win very quickly. The power of a control deck is almost entirely tied to your win condition. A War of Attrition gets harder to win the longer the war goes on. So if you're playing Baral all counterspells and Baral is your only win con, yeah, you could throw 3 counterspells a turn cycle, but how long can you keep that up for before the Baral does 21 damage to each opponent? Let's say you have set up a removal engine, Grave Pact, Reassembling Skeleton, Sack Outlet. This can really slow down your opponents and make it hard for them to swing into you, but eventually somebody will draw enchantment removal, and then they'll attack you with all the creatures they didn't cast and held in hand. So your clock is very important. We've talked about removal and getting card draw or value to repeatedly use that removal, but how do you actually win the game? Looking at finishers, at the top of power level is combo. This is probably not a surprise to anybody. Combo is the strongest way to win in a format where you have 3 opponents and they all have 40 life. Looking at something like a Talion CDH list, we can see the deck is just card advantage engines, including one in the command zone, spot removal, tutors, and an efficient combo. This is a very strong deck. It is able to quickly turn the corner. Once this deck is in a commanding position with card advantage engines and their opponents have had their resources drained, a Talion deck will be able to quickly tutor or draw into their combo within just a few turns. The faster you can convert this state of attrition and outvaluing into a win, the more powerful your control deck. Combos are the best since the clock is just how fast you can draw into it, and it doesn't really matter what your opponents are doing. But let's say you're not playing CDH, and you're not looking for a high power deck. Let's focus on mid to low power control from here on out. What type of finishers are we looking at? There are quite a few options. It can be as simple as a really big creature. Honestly, this is a good, clean option. There are lots of creatures that can easily scale up damage and quickly end the game. If you're a Simic deck, you can play something like Coma and make an army of 3/3s. Any of these army and a can cards can be great finishers in a control deck. I mean, something as simple as a Desolation Twin on an empty board will end games pretty quickly. Alternatively, creatures that are mana sinks can also take over games in the late game. Memnarch, Geth Lord of the Vault, and the aforementioned Sisters of Stone Death can be used to steal many things and get a massive board with just one creature. Another option is evasive threats, things that stick around a lot. Aetherling is the old school classic control finisher for 60 card formats, but you can do the same with something like Nezahal or any creature that can dodge board wipes and hits decently hard. These are excellent finishers because if things start to get out of hand and your opponents play more things, you can cast a board wipe, dodge it with your Nezahal, and then continue punching after you've board wiped. You could also use Planeswalkers, since keeping them safe for a few turns can usually get you towards a near game-winning ult. Assemble the Legion is another personal favorite of mine. The damage can ramp up so fast, especially when paired with any Anthem or ETB damage effect. Theft effects are also great here, since they do double duty as finishers and spot removal. Lastly, many control decks will finish the game with some card that simply scales well into the late game, like a Rise of the Dark Realms or an Insurrection. Late game, after you've cast a couple of board wipes, a Rise of the Dark Realms can give you all the value you need to win the game. Insurrection is also a great finisher. If you're playing a control shell that's utilizing a lot of Pillow Fort effects, this can be a great way to close out the game by yoinking all those creatures that have been Pillow Forted into swinging to other players and just alpha striking the whole table. And it wouldn't be a commander video without talking about commanders. So who makes a good leader for your control deck? This can vary a lot, and many different commanders can be turned into control decks. But if we look at each part of a control deck, removal, card draw, finisher. It's best if your commander fulfills one of these criteria. Card draw is one of the most straightforward options here. If your commander gets you cards, then it's easier to fill your deck with spot removal. This is why Tymna is one of the strongest commanders in EDH. Removal clears the board, which lets Tymna and friends swing in for damage, drawing you more cards, so you can keep removing the board, so on and so forth. Tymna is very good at winning the war of attrition. Removal in the command zone is another great option. Vona, Butcher of Magan, is a good example. This gives you the ability to blow up the most threatening card every turn. Or Venser Shaper Savant, when coupled with flicker effects, will let you keep dangerous things off the board. Lastly, a finisher in the command zone is an excellent way to let your control deck turn the corner when you need it. Chromium the Mutable is a perfect top end for a control deck. It can dodge spot removal with the activated ability, and a 7/7 flying commander will take out anybody in 3 hits, letting you knock out the most threatening opponent pretty quickly. So that's everything. We've talked about removal, card draw, repeatable removal, value type stuff, finishers, and who to put at the helm of your deck. Now you should know how to identify a control deck and build one, but I haven't told you why you should build one. One of the first things I need to clear up is, are control decks fun? This is something a lot of people seem to get hung up on. Will my playgroup get mad if I counter a spell? And is removal just stopping players from winning? Is that rude? I would argue no. I don't think so. For starters, anecdotally, I have played a lot of control decks in Commander for many years, and I've really never heard anything negative. Actually, at the stores I played in, I was mostly remembered as the guy playing weird artifacts more than I was remembered as the control player. Ultimately, like a lot of things, there's a lot of animosity you might see online if you read Reddit or Twitter or whatever. But the majority of real players in the real world are just looking for some games of Commander and are pretty chill with most things outside of hard stacks or super fast combo. And if you are watching this thinking, I hate control decks, let me give you some advice. I see how control, especially for new players, can be really tricky to beat. It might feel like nothing you do matters because all of your threats are removed and you didn't get to do anything. But this can be solved in one of 2 ways. If you are a more aggressive deck, just attack the control player before they set up their engines. The way to beat control decks is by forcing them to use removal on your threats instead of your card draw, causing them to lose the war of attrition. A lot of players will deploy their threats early and spread out the damage by attacking everybody evenly, which just makes beating the control deck really difficult. They have better late game than you, so don't let them get to the late game. It's a really common mistake that I see. The second option is to sandbag. If you're not an aggro deck and have a strong late game, perhaps some green pile with big dangerous threats, don't be the first person to try and slam down your finishers. Or the second person, or the third. If you see a control deck at the table while everybody is deploying threats, if you aren't getting pressured, wait for that first board wipe. Be a little greedy, play more ramp and more card draw without committing very hard to the board. As a control player, nothing pleases me more than everybody playing their 4-drop into 5-drop into 6-drop, and then they lined up the board like pins at a bowling alley, ready for my board wipe to land a strike. I'm very bad at bowling in real life. Luckily for me, Supreme Verdict can't be a gutter ball. It always does the thing. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent about why control might be frustrating and some ways to get around it. Let's get back on track. Why play control? Let me paint a picture. I'm about as good at art as I am at bowling. Imagine you're playing a game of Commander, and someone gets off to a fast start, and then they keep playing things and drawing cards, and then they just win, and nobody stopped them. The game was very uninteresting, unceremonious, and uninteractive. This is one of the most boring, uninteresting types of games. The classic pub stomp. Whether or not it's an intentional pub stomp, the deck hit all of its powerful value engines early and outvalued the entire table. There are a lot of mid-range snowbally decks that can do this regularly. I've been a huge proponent of the Playmore Removal argument for basically the whole history of this channel. And it's not just so I can say, haha, get good or whatever. It's because genuinely, removal makes games more fun. Imagine a world where there wasn't any removal. Nobody could stop anyone from doing anything. Then whomever finds their win con first just wins, and that's it. You hit your combo first, you hit your overrun first, you win, there is no counterplay. The game would be so much less dynamic and so much less interesting. And I think a lot of players seem to play this way. I've met so many people that really get this defeatist attitude in the game when one player gets pretty far ahead. You can recover from a player getting ahead if you play removal. Removal just fixes so many issues. If someone got ahead early because of burst fast mana, removal is excellent for that since it's like a 2-for-1. If somebody brought a fast combo deck, great, you can disrupt that combo and then they have to figure out what their plan B is. Does one player have a deck which is much stronger than everyone else's? Your extra removal can slow them down and let the other players work together to take them out. Control games, especially without a combo finisher, are scrappy and they really come down to the wire. You're really racing against the whole table. Once they realize, hey, the control player is the archenemy, you need to scramble to figure out how you're actually going to close out the game here. Can you get into 3 hits with Chromium before they're able to break out of your Pillow Fort lock or whatever? It means the dynamics of the game shift heavily and quickly, and it's very difficult for one player to get so far ahead. I think that those types of games are incredibly fun. And there's still one more reason I think control decks are so great: budget. Control decks are easily one of the best ways to build a powerful deck on a budget. There are many excellent ways to build budget decks. I made a whole video about it a while ago. And those decks were designed with ways to repeatedly get card draw. I feel like for any competent mid-range deck in Casual Commander, repeatable card draw, or at least quite a bit of card draw, is a must, allowing you to refill and redeploy and refill again as things get cleared off the board. But once you have your card advantage engine, a control shell is a really great budget-friendly option to build around that engine. The problem with trying to outvalue non-budget decks is that they often have higher card quality. Yes, both of you can cast a draw 3 effect, but if they're running stronger synergy cards than you are, their draw 3 will be worth more. But you know what's cheap? Removal that's been reprinted 100 times. If you and an opponent are both playing +1/+1 counter decks, Doubling Season can be tricky to beat. It's an expensive card and it's one of the best for counters decks. If all you have is a Hardened Scales as your accelerant, it might be difficult to keep up, especially if they're able to have Hardened Scales and Doubling Season in play. But guess what does beat Doubling Season? Crozan Grip, Negate, Disenchant. If instead you counter their draw 3 and then cast your own draw 3, suddenly you're ahead, you have more things in hand that you can do. Someone's casting a big Eldrazi, about to refill their hand because of the cast trigger, boom, Summary Dismissal, no Eldrazi, no cards. And almost every removal spell that's 3 mana or more is dirt cheap. Windgrace's Judgment, Desertion, Render Silent, all great options for control decks that are easy to buy. Most of the expensive counterspells are the low mana value ones that are very good at protecting your combos. But remember, as a control deck, we're not using counter magic defensively, we're using it offensively in a proactive manner to hit our opponent's value engines, and maybe even steal a few pieces in the process. Creature-focused themes are easily the most popular in EDH by a wide margin. So if you're building a rat deck, your opponents might have access to some of the more popular, expensive support cards that go in that. Which is why when building on a budget, the support cards for control archetypes are simply cheaper, simply because they have less demand. I also see a lot of players talk about the Commander Arms Race, where they have to continue to buy more fast mana and more powerful cards to speed up their deck so they can win 1 turn faster than their opponents. But this isn't always the case. Instead, you can grind 1 turn longer, control the pace of the game 1 turn further. The Commander Arms Race does not need to be you trying to outspeed the fastest deck, but instead slowing them down a bit to match the rest of the table. And this option is often a lot more budget friendly than buying fast mana to outrace them. I'm not saying that you have to play control to play removal, but because removal is so cheap compared to other mid-rangey decks, if you play control and overload on removal, your deck will often be cheaper. Something like Melik or Forged Researcher can turn these expensive counterspells into mana-efficient powerhouses. Plus, late game Melik can crash in for big damage, so you have a finisher in the command zone as well. Or an Azorius commander like Council of 4 gives you card draw and chump blockers, so you can keep up on cards and avoid taking damage while you take your time to set up whatever win con you want. And how about a non-blue option, Ronos the Indomitable? This can turn any fight spell into a destroy target creature effect, letting you have a mountain of spot removal in your mono green deck. Plus, with all the card draw that lets you draw based on the power of a creature, and this being a 3-mana 5/5, you can keep your hand full of interaction. And these green effects are a dime a dozen, so are fight spells, meaning this shell is really cheap. Okay, this has been a long video, and I hope it's given you some insight about control decks. I couldn't touch on everything here. There's so much more to say, like having a high land count or playing politics, but that's all stuff that you'll probably learn with experience. Hopefully I've inspired you to try a control deck. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer as many as I can in the comments. And if you are a fellow control aficionado, feel free to give some suggestions as well. Thank you so very much for watching. Ultra special thanks to all of my patrons who support me on this channel. It really means a lot. You can see my tier 3 patrons scrolling here. If you want to support me further than liking or subscribing, check out the Patreon. I have a couple of perks and you can be in the credits as well. Also, let me know what you think of these longer videos. Do you like them? Do you dislike them? What did you think of the additional advertisement? Was it too intrusive? Was it too cringe? Let me know in the comments below. And don't say anything mean about JoJo. He reads all the comments.